is Kyle Volk. I teach political history here at the University of Montana, and welcome to our annual Constitution Day lecture. Constitution Day commemorates the signing of the United States Constitution on September 17, 1787. Has its own history. It's a history that's tied to our subject tonight, the power of the American state. In 2004, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia attached a rider to a massive appropriations bill requiring all educational institutions that receive federal funding to provide an educational program on the Constitution. So here we are. Since that time, the Provost office has been kind enough to fund an annual lecture tackling some aspect of the history and life of the United States Constitution. So we'd like to thank the Provost's office especially for his support of this program. It's my great pleasure to introduce this year's speaker, Professor William J. Novak. Bill Novak is a professor of law and history at the University of Michigan Law School. Bill was trained as a historian. He earned his PhD from Brandeis University in 1991. He's the author of multiple books and articles, including the 1996 prize-winning book entitled The People's Welfare, Law and Regulation in 19th Century America. He's currently working on the follow-up, a much awaited follow-up to that study, a new book that's titled The People's Government, Law and the Creation of the Modern American State. So before heading to Michigan, Professor Novak was a member of the history department at the University of Chicago, where he was a founding member of the university's Human Rights Program and the director of its Center for Comparative Legal History. And I wanted to point out that aside from his own scholarly work, Bill has also had a profound influence as a mentor. His graduate students, and there are many of them, have gone on to take positions at such schools as Brown University, University of Cincinnati, University of California, Berkeley, University of California, San Diego, Northwestern University, Brandeis University, University of Minnesota, University of New Mexico, the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and Indiana University Law School. So I think it's safe to say that Bill has left his mark on the current generation of American political and legal historians. His talk tonight is called The Constitution and the Myth of the Weak American State. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bill Novak.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyle, for that very nice introduction. Is the volume, they wanted me to use this, is that good? Good volume for the entire room? Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank all of you for coming out. I look forward to a nice discussion, and I'll certainly leave time for plenty of discussion afterwards. I'd like to thank the History Department, the Law School, Michael Mayer, Kyle for inviting me here. It's just a pleasure to be here. So I'll jump right into it, and I thought what I'd do tonight is start with three different historical quotations that I think capture the spirit of the basic intervention, the basic point that I would like to talk about this evening. So the first quote comes from a late 19th century American commentator, a pretty smart guy, Albert Shaw. He's writing in 1887 an article entitled, appropriate to our topic tonight, The American State and the American Man. So this is 1887. This is what he says, quote, "The prevalence of laissez-faire as a practical rule in the United States passes unchallenged by the great majority of intelligent Americans. The average American has an unequaled capacity for the entertainment of legal fictions and kindred delusions. Never for a moment relinquishing their theory of laissez-faire," Shaw goes on, "the people of the United States have pursued a practical policy that is utterly inconsistent with that theory, and they've not perceived the discrepancy." He goes on to review the thousands of state regulations of social economic life being passed by legislatures in the late 19th century. By one estimate, state and federal governments in this period are passing about 62,000 new statutes every 5 years or so. So this is nothing new in the American regime. And Shaw concludes, quote, The one common and striking characteristic of this huge collection of new statutes is its utter disregard of the laissez-faire principle. They deal with the citizen in every conceivable relation, and my favorite line, this is 1887, they seem to have left nothing for future legislatures to regulate. Second quote, I'm cheating a little bit, but I'm going to use a quote from Sidney Webb from the same period, 1889. Sidney Webb, of course, is English. He's writing about London, but I think this quote also resonates a little bit with what's going on in American cities, particularly in the progressive era. If you think of Cleveland under Mayor Tom Johnson and the so-called red mayor, Newton Baker, supporting kind of municipal gas, municipal light, municipal dance halls, etc. Newton Baker, the so-called red mayor, would later become an ardent opponent of FDR and the New Deal and an ardent liberty leaguer. So sometimes political positions change quite radically over time. So I think this could fit a little bit in Newton Baker's Cleveland as well. Webb puts it this way, quote, "The individualist city councilor will walk along the municipal pavement, lit by municipal gas, cleansed by municipal brooms with municipal water, and seeing by the municipal clock in the municipal market that he is too early to meet his children, coming from the municipal school, hard by the county lunatic asylum and municipal hospital, will use the national telegraph system to tell them not to walk through the municipal park, but to come by the municipal tramway, to meet him in the municipal reading room, by the municipal art gallery, museum, and library, where he intends to consult some of the national publications in order to prepare his next speech in the municipal town hall in favor of increased governmental regulation of the railway system. Socialism, sir, he will say in this talk, don't waste the time of a practical man by your fantastic absurdities. Self-help, sir. Individual self-help is what has made this city what it is today." Last quote from Senator Fritz Hollings. So now it's a little bit more up to date, but he's directly channeling Sidney Webb. He must have read the Webb quote now if you follow this quote. And I know that's a bit scary, Fritz Hollings and bringing Fritz Hollings and Sidney Webb together. This is in a stump speech that Fritz Hollings used frequently when he was running in 1984 seeking the Democratic nomination for president. This is in the heart of Ronald Reagan's America. And it is not a direct quote because Hollings would ad lib a little bit, but it's basically this story. He tells the story of a guy who comes home from the Korean War, goes to college on a form of the GI Bill, opens a business with a small business administration loan, makes sure his parents' farm was adequately wired through rural electrification, irrigated with assistance from the Army Corps of Engineers, saw his kids get subsidized school lunches at a school that received lab equipment from a National Science Foundation grant, got his mortgage from the FHA, got hurricane disaster relief from FEMA. Those are better days for FEMA back then. And one day decides to get on Amtrak so that he can go to Washington and tell his congressman to get government off his back. So, all three of these quotes, I think, suggest a kind of fundamental disconnect at the heart of American constitutional history that continues to fascinate me and that has been at the center of almost all my kind of research and writing. It's a paradox centered around the tension between what we might think about as the kind of national bedtime story that we Americans like to narrate ourselves about our past, right? About rugged individualism, self-reliance, property and contract rights, the free market, the rule of law, that story, and then the very different history of our concrete national institutions that in reality have been quite capable over time of wielding pretty unprecedented interventionist, coercive, indeed regulatory power at home as well as abroad from the 18th century to the very present. Right? These two things are in tension with one another, the story we tell and then the history of this kind of regulatory state. The political scientist Samuel Huntington once dubbed this yawning gap between facts, between norms, cognitive dissonance, an almost pathological tendency that he saw to confuse a fictional American ideal about individual liberty with a historical political reality of ever-expanding governmental power. Now, the great legal historian Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. used to like to say that there's nothing like a paradox to rip the scum from the mind. And so I think it's perhaps fitting on Constitution Day to start thinking hard about this paradox and see where we can get. Thinking about this gap, this persistent gap between American constitutional reality on the one hand and the constitutional ideal, constitutional fact versus constitutional fancy. It's a gap that seems to me to be widening only today as ideas about constitutional history increasingly take center stage, as you're all perfectly aware, right? In prominent, heated, and increasingly quite polemical national debates about such things ranging from guns to executive authority to war powers to eminent domain to regulation to healthcare, you name it. Constitutional history is frequently deployed, or ideas about constitutional history are frequently deployed in this heated debate that's going on today. As a humorous headline from the newspaper The Onion, a humorous newspaper, captured the typical and ubiquitous use of constitutional history in current public debate, and I like to collect these newspaper articles every once in a while. Area man, passionate defender of what he imagines the Constitution to be. What he imagines the Constitution to be, right? This is the version of the problem I want to examine this evening. The idea of a rather simple kind of imagined constitutional past that frequently trumps, it seems to me, the ever larger and complex realities of modern American history and politics. That these two things, there's a disconnect there, they don't fit together very well. So I'd like to approach this paradox in kind of two separate parts. First, I want to start by discussing in fairly general, almost theoretical terms, the creation of this idea of a simple constitutional imagined past, what I call the myth of the weak state. I'd like to explain that a little bit on a general level, but for those of you that want particulars, I'll give you more than enough particulars in the second half of the class where I think about some of the constitutional facts, the constitutional realities that don't fit comfortably, right, with the constitutional mythology that we frequently deploy. Okay? So first, a little bit generally about the constitutional mythology in the United States. This disjunction between American power and American constitutional narrative, the American present and the American constitutional past, I think is especially visible today, right? The American present, our present, witnesses the steady aggrandizement of executive, administration, think Treasury Department, if you want an example of expanding authority in this period, spending powers, borrowing powers, emergency powers, penal powers, military, war powers. As contemporary commentators like Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, Giorgio Agamben actually contemplate the contours of a kind of new kind of American hegemony and superpower, right, in an early 21st century age of empire. That seems to me to be a bit of the American present. The story of the American past, American history, however, continues to frequently be told in narratives that seem to be blithely heading off somewhere else, right? That the story can't quite get to where we are today, can't explain how we got to the predicament we are in today. In place of the growth of power, the constitutional history that America most frequently tells itself highlights a story, as you're all aware, of relative powerlessness, right? Of a government that should have relative powerlessness. A usually benign tale of legal political self-abnegation, right? Emphasizing, you've all heard this language, constitutional limitations, restraints like federalism, individual rights, checks and, you all learned this in fourth grade, right? Checks and balances, separate, it's a limited government. It's a limited government. Look around you, right? But it's a limited government, is the story we tell ourselves. The rule of law, laissez-faire. Those are the stories we tell, and they're in conflict with this powerful state that's been created. When framed more positively, American constitutional history is presented usually from historians of all different political stripes and ideological backgrounds. It's almost always told as a freedom story, as a liberty story. And in fact, I do this. You can look at the titles of most of the great surveys of American history, again, from the 1930s to the 1950s to the present, across the whole range of ideological positions taken by historians over time. And liberty and freedom is usually the theme. That's the way we tell the story of American history. As a freedom narrative, a struggle for political liberty, a struggle for emancipation from bondage, the rise of individual, civil, economic, and social rights in the modern era. It seems to me that coming to terms with the historical rise of the more formal and institutional mechanisms of legal, political, economic, corporate, and technological power that currently shapes so much of the globe, and including all of our lives, is a more difficult task than it should be. because of the presence of primarily a liberty freedom narrative that doesn't interrogate these new forms of power. A crucial component of this American historical and constitutional narrative concerns the nature, power, and reach of the American state. While much of modern history tries to come to terms with the actions of powerful nation states and the consequences of their rise, expansion, and sometimes fall, discussion of the American state, arguably one of the most influential and powerful in modern times, remains trapped in a different past and a rather peculiar language and idiom. The phrase the American state is seen as something almost like an oxymoron in a land that so frequently in its narrative talks about anti-statism, right? Anti-government, statelessness. When acknowledged at all, the American version of the state is viewed as something not quite fully formed, never wholly realized, something less, something laggard, something underdeveloped when compared to the mature governmental regimes, let's say, of modern Europe. An enduring and exceptional tendency to view the American state throughout its history as distinctively weak continues to frustrate, I think, a thorough reckoning with the nature of American governmental power in the early 21st century. So this is what I refer to as the myth of the weak American state, and let me just say another word or two about it. The tired and worn out myth of the weak, so you see how I feel about it. The tired and worn out myth of the weak American state is to the history of American politics what the myth of the Lochner Court, and I'll say more about this in a minute, is to the history of constitutional law, and what the myth of laissez-faire is, as Shaw knew as early as 1887, to actual American political economy. Like the myths of Lochner and laissez-faire, the idea of a weak state is the product of a larger tendency to read American history as truly exceptional, right? This is American exceptionalism. As the history of the making of a new people, the making of a new world, especially outside the corruptions and historical currents of old Europe, right? That this is indeed a new land. It's part of the myth of the United States, of America as a place of rebirth, the idea of American Adam, right, emerging fresh from a veritable state of nature. As all you know, as John Locke put it, right, in his great treatises, thus in the beginning all the world was America. This is a great origin story, right, in terms of American Adam emerging new without some of the baggage of European history and European government. The idea has many dimensions, but I think overall, together, they overemphasize the so-called natural development of individualism, private rights, civil society, free labor, and free economy in American history, and those things all should be there, but I think they need to be placed in proper context. And such myths consequently tend to downplay or at least distract historical attention or political attention or citizen attention from looking at, right, more historical and artificial roles of collective decision-making, public law, regulation, and government in American political and economic life. The state itself is seen as something of a menacing European contrivance that never really finds a place in a free, unregulated, and stateless America. So this idea of a weak state originates in some classic sources and analyses. Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the more famous foreign commentators on American life, his famous comparative emphasis on individualism, associationalism, localism, and administrative decentralization led him to underestimate, as early as the early 19th century, the power of the state in America. Though many of Tocqueville's prophecies concerning the future of democratic and despotic trends in modern governance have salience today, I think Tocqueville was a pretty good prophet on many accounts, his forecast concerning American state development was pretty much inaccurate, right? As Tocqueville put it in 1835, unless I'm strangely mistaken, he hedged, and he always hedges. This is why you can't, right? Unless I'm strangely mistaken, the federal government of the United States is tending to get daily weaker. This is 1835. Stage by stage, it withdraws from public affairs, continually narrowing its sphere of action. Being naturally weak, it gives up even the appearance of strength. So 1835, Tocqueville can only see a state contracting. G.W.F. Hegel continued, these are some big names, right? So this theory has a lot of philosophical weight behind it. Continued the comparative European tradition of seeing in the American state something less, something laggard, something underdeveloped, reflecting on what he perceived to be, and this is a quote, an entire immunity from public burdens. There were no public burdens in the United States as Hegel saw it. He questioned whether the United States was, quote unquote, a real state at all. For a real state, he said, a real government arises only after the distinction of classes has arisen. But even after the socioeconomic transformations of the late 19th century, when class distinctions are arising and public burdens are accelerating, a wide variety of commentators continued to find an answer to Werner Sombart's classic historical question, why is there no socialism in the United States, in an exceptional American political culture displaying a characteristic anti-statism, right? So the weak state, anti-statism has been seen as a kind of major cause for American exceptionalism. But rather incongruously, the heyday for, I think, the most popular expansion of the notion of the weak American state actually occurred in the middle of the 20th century. And this is odd, right? Because this is the period where the United States is clearly on its rise as a global power. This is the heart of Henry Luce's so-called American century. But in the midst of brutal conflicts with totalitarian states, American scholars continually hesitated to draw direct comparisons between American politics and European politics, particularly European states. And on the contrary, a proliferation of American studies is born in the 1950s, places renewed emphasis on an exceptional national historical trajectory, an alternative American Sonderweg, a kind of American special path, rooted primarily in negative liberty, voluntarism, self-interested liberalism, and a self-regulating market, all limiting the role of the state in America's social and economic progress. In intense political times, historians like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Daniel Boorstin, to a lesser extent Louis Hartz, fashioned a compelling and remarkably consistent American narrative that explained the United States' special path as the product of a persistent preference for society over polity, individual initiative over collective action, private competition and voluntarism over public regulation and state direction, right? These are the kinds of things that are seen as defining the American way, making American exceptionalism different from European paths of development. Within this ideologically charged template, the history of the American state and its public policies and purposes almost disappeared in the middle of the 20th century. People just stopped looking, to a large extent, at governmental policies. And even radical governmental and regulatory interventions dissolved into the harmless miasma of national cultural mythology, right? That we simply didn't do those things here. But perhaps the most remarkable testament to this resilience of the idea or the myth of the weak state is the degree to which this Cold War fiction has only been reinvigorated by post-Cold War fascination with neoliberalism, deregulation, privatization, and the overarching tendency to characterize American governance and American state as something not quite in the real state category of Hegel continues unabated. The tendency has generated a series of odd and rather strange adjectives that usually precede discussions of the American state. I sort of collect these strange adjectives, so if you find any good ones, feel free to email me and send them on. But the American state is constantly referred to in adjectives like this: the uneasy state, the divided state, the reluctant state, a patchwork, a hapless giant, a weakened spring, an incomplete conquest, a Tudor polity. In a word, right, seeing the American state and American government as an anachronism in the modern world, okay? But let me turn to some particulars and see if this idea actually fits historical reality. But of course, the American state, as you all know in this room, is anything but an anachronism. It's not a throwback to another era, right? We are talking about the most powerful geopolitical and legal economic entity in world history. It's as simple as that. That's the thing that needs historical explaining, not some kind of Tudor, what were those terms? Hapless giant, weakened spring. It simply seems not to fit. And the special force of the American state, I think particularly in this generation, right, in the first years of the 21st century, I think is already sparking a reconsideration of some of the constitutional mythology of weak statism just described. Indeed, a new generation of scholars has come of age in an era when European statist regimes don't appear particularly threatening at all to us, right, and to our neighbors, while the American form of legal and economic life and order is being radically extended across the globe, right? It's American power in the early 21st century that seems to be expanding, not European forms of state assertion. The obvious present reality of American state power in the early 21st century, in other words, is forcing a much-needed reconsideration of the history of the rise of a global Leviathan. The most significant and lasting theme of this revisionism, and I think there are a lot of scholars, there are a lot of commentators, a lot of citizens, I think, participating in this, is the recognition that the American state has been and is consistently stronger, larger, more durable, more interventionist, and more redistributive than any accounted for in earlier accounts of United States constitutional history, right? This kind of recognition that this is what we have to explain. New histories of the American state and Constitution strive to grasp one of the glaring central facts about modern American history, the development of a global geopolitical as well as legal economic hegemon. That is what needs explaining in modern history. How did we get here? How did we get to our present? Amid the torrent of exceptionalist analyses of the limits, weakness, backwardness of the American state, American history, in other words, has overlooked the elephant in the room, right? The steadily aggrandizing authority of one of the most powerful nation states in world history. Some specifics. Because once you start thinking about that, once you stop trying to talk about American exceptionalism and the American weak state, and you start focusing, right, towards explaining the reality as opposed to reinforcing the fiction, evidence of the historical reality and construction of American state power is not hard to find at all. Once you start looking for it, it's all around us, from the earliest days of the Republic to the very recent present. Max Edling, for example, a historian, has recently recentered histories of the American constitutional founding around the idea of the creation of a strong fiscal military state in the early Republic, corroborating Hannah Arendt's observation that, quote, and Hannah Arendt gets this exactly right, it seems to me, as she does many things, and probably the best book on the French and American revolutions called On Revolution, that, quote, the true objective of the American Constitution was not to limit, but to create more power, to establish a new power center. It seems to me she gets that exactly right. Remember, we did once have a weak state and a limited government in the United States. It was called the Articles of Confederation, right? And it's to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, to get rid of a weak state regime, right, that the founders, in emulating, in trying to create a nation state that could play on the world stage equal to the European states, right, proposed a new federal constitution. It's not to limit power. If you want to limit power, you keep the Articles of Confederation, thank you. But that would have been an abysmal disaster, right? And the American history and the United States would look quite different today if, in fact, the regime of the Articles of Confederation persisted, as opposed to the nationalizing influence, as John Marshall perfectly realized, of the new American Constitution, right? That the main purpose of the Constitutional Convention of the Founding Fathers was, frankly, factually, to create a stronger central and national government, a more powerful state after the abysmal failure of the Articles. Other historians, Jerry Mishaw, an administrative historian at Yale, is now tracing the origins of a powerful American administrative state and regulatory state to the very first days of the early Republic. Richard John is single-handedly almost revising notions of the lack of a real large federal government force in American life before the Civil War through his study of all things, the prominent role of the U.S. Post Office in the 19th century, right? A federal governmental institution that becomes the basis for most roads in the United States. It later becomes the basis for most telegraph lines in the United States. The post office in the 19th century is the internet of the 19th century. It's where people get information. They get seeds. Farmers get seeds through the post office. The franking privilege in Congress allows congressmen to pass scientific treatises around the United States. Business information travels from coast to coast through the U.S. post office. Much maligned today, but I assure you in the 19th century it was a very significant federal governmental institution. And interestingly, at a time when statist, strong state nations like Great Britain and France boasted a total of 17 and 4 post offices per 100,000 population respectively, okay, 17 and 4 per 100,000. The individualist and anti-statist U.S. boasted a total of 74 per 100,000. And there's a lot more, right? There's a lot more building to do in the United States in this period. Richard White, as some of you know, there's a great sort of Western history tradition here at the University of Montana. Richard White was key in really reorienting us towards the history of the West in recent years. He has placed federal governmental power at the center of the new Western history, involving such things as Indian removal, military and commercial development, and westward expansion. It wasn't just some cultural manifest destiny, right? This is going to take some state power to clear the West, to settle the West in an effective way. As the work of a generation or more of social and cultural historians have made absolutely clear, Indian removal, slavery, immigration restriction, and racial, religious, and gender-based forms of discrimination were not the products of laissez-faire or a general American tendency to leave people alone. Right? You can't, if laissez-faire, leaving people alone is the story, it's very difficult to explain slavery, Indian, right? If that's the general tendency. In fact, something else is going on. We have to look beneath the surface to see what is going on. As William James used to like to say, the trail of the serpent is over all, right? There's a kind of underbelly here. It's worth remembering in this context that John Stuart Mill's great classic, in John Stuart Mill's classic liberal text, perhaps one of the greatest rights texts ever written, right? The book On Liberty in the middle of the 19th century. All of his classical examples of governmental overreaching into people's lives, and Mill is English, they don't come from England. The examples don't come from England. They don't come from France. They don't come from Prussia. All his examples of governmental overreaching, right, of too strong of a state in Mill's perspective, come from the United States. Sunday laws, what are these democratic Americans running around trying to regulate what people are doing on Sunday, whether they're drinking, whether they're traveling, whether they're selling, right? Why are these Americans doing this in the middle of the 19th century? Sunday laws, liquor regulation, the intense, prohibition is a major statist experiment. It failed, yes, right? There was pushback, but what an extraordinary state experiment in state governmental power that dominated American political life, as Kyle Vogt very well knows, from the early days of the 19th century to the middle, almost the middle of the 20th century. And the persecution of the Mormons. Those are his examples of governmental overreaching in the United States, and the United States is not the exception. It seems to be the rule, the thing that John Stuart Mill is worried about, at least in the area of social regulation. So, one can hardly explain the role of American military might, or the national and international commercial development, yet alone the role of the prison or the death penalty, or racial segregation, or the growth of executive emergency or war-making powers in American public life by continued reference to a weak state tradition or an original constitutional tradition of governmental limitation or self-abnegation. Such ideas, such ideals, simply cannot explain historical reality. The ideas of American state weakness, statelessness, or anti-statism, I think, need to be abandoned. And we need to create some new storylines. Such formulations no longer explain the past, and I think you would all agree they certainly cannot account for our current present. Okay? So, that was a rather breakneck sprint through American history, through examples of state power from the founding of the Founding Fathers through the military-industrial complex in one paragraph. In the time remaining, I'd like to just spend a little more time to say a little more focused and detailed word about two historical periods in which I think the myth of the weak state is particularly predominant, particularly strong, and spectacularly wrong. Okay, so to talk a little bit more detail, so I can give you, again, some of the flavor of the facts that I think somehow conflate the mythology. The first period I'd like to address is the period directly after the drafting of the Constitution in 1787. Certainly, I think one might think there, of all places, if you're going to find it, one might find a golden age of American individualism and limited government. right? Indeed, what a finer and more direct testament to liberty and individualism could there be than the text of the American Bill of Rights, formally added to the Constitution, proposed in 1789, securing basic rights to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to a jury trial, protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to bear arms, etc., etc. What are these, if not the ultimate individualistic, almost mythic rights foundations of American exceptionalism and American constitutionalism? Well, as it turns out, a couple of intriguing things are worth noting, right, about the meaning of this document historically, right, in this first period after the founding of the Constitution. First, despite the degree to which we currently refer to the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution as a Bill of Rights, before the Civil War, the U.S. Supreme Court never did so. And there's a really wonderful book for those of you that are interested by Akhil Amar at Yale Law School on the Bill of Rights that has a great kind of historical sensibility about these things, that the Bill of Rights will mean fundamentally different things, right, in the early 19th century and after the Civil War. Also, we now know, rather counterintuitively, that some of these rights were originally not really about protecting the individual from government generally at all, right? For example, the Establishment Clause of the all-important First Amendment did not originally function as it does today as a kind of primary defense of individualistic religious freedom through a kind of separation of church and state. But in fact, the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause in the first days of the Republic, actually functioned as something of a protector for some state-established churches, protecting them from congressional action later down the road or from future federal intervention. And indeed, early American law was full of governmental attempts to regulate individual religion, from official state establishment in some states to Sunday laws, which we've already mentioned, to blasphemy prosecutions, to the federal government persecution of the Mormons. But the protection of state establishment suggests an even more significant limitation on the original understanding of the American Bill of Rights, and that is the fact that until the adoption of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution simply did not apply to the states, right? That those rights are not understood as applying, as being limits on state governments. They apply to Congress, especially and particularly. And interestingly, right, even a kind of nationalist Chief Justice like John Marshall could understand that principle straightforwardly. And in the states is where most of the governing, most of the regulating was going on in antebellum America. And there the Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments to the Constitution, were almost beside the point. Parenthetically, it's worth noting that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights together only expressly prohibited three things absolutely against both the state and the federal governments. What are those three things? I think the three things tell you something about what the founders are actually concerned about, right? What are the three things that they're going to take out of the mix and not allow either the federal government or the state government to do? And it's interesting that there's only three in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, right? No bills of attainder, no ex post facto laws, and both of those are ways of really, I sometimes tell my students, what are the first things, if you're advising a despot on becoming a sort of good despot in the world today, what do? And actually, if you think about what a despot does, the despot will start doing almost exactly all of the things that the Bill of Rights are designed to keep governments from doing, right? Try to eliminate your political opposition, right? This would be your advice to the despot, right? Get rid of free speech, throw your opponents in jail, right? Shut down the press, take over the police, take over the court system. That's what the Bill of Rights is designed to do. That's what's reflected in no bills of attainder, no ex post facto laws, and interestingly enough, no titles of nobility. There will be no Sir Elton Johns or Paul McCartneys in this land. But again, it tells you something about what they're concerned about as opposed to what we invoke the Bill of Rights to be about in a later period. So in fact, I think contrary to popular mythology, at the state and local level, the early 19th century United States was a period of intense state and local regulation of social and economic life. It's not an individualistic or rights-based period at all when you look at what's going on in most people's lives and what the government is doing, particularly the state and local governance. In my first book, The People's Welfare, I tried to come to terms with the vast panoply and inventory of regulations that dominate early American society. Regulations on public safety, public economy, public health, public property. Tonight there's not much time, so I can't give you a real insight into a lot of those, but I can use a list to give you some flavor of the kinds of things that states were regulating in the United States in the early 19th century. Between 1781 and 1801, okay, here's a great point of origin. 1781 and 1801, the New York State Legislature passed special laws regulating, here comes the list, lotteries, hawkers and peddlers, the firing of guns, usury, frauds, the buying and selling of offices, beggars and disorderly persons, rents and leases, the firing of woods, stray cattle and sheep, mines, ferries, apprentices and servants, bastards, idiots and lunatics, counselors, attorneys and solicitors. Some of these, there's some overlap and some of these can't. Travel, labor, play on Sunday, cursing, swearing, drunkenness, the exportation of flaxseed, gaming, inspection. The list goes on. Poor relief, highways, it goes on to the next page. I won't bother you with it. And lists like that are duplicated across the state and municipal jurisdictions of early America in this so-called golden age of liberalism. At the federal level, the record is even more interventionist, as the very first Congress in the United States begins immediately legislating in the effort now to put this stronger government that needs to be built to compete with the European states in a kind of increasingly nationalist order, world order, begins putting that together. And if you want to take a look at this, I would urge everyone simply to look at the statutory output of the first two Congresses in the United States. I mean, it's sometimes called a continuing constitutional convention in action, because many of the same people that were at the Constitutional Convention are now in Congress. What do they start doing? They start setting up a pretty strong and increasingly powerful federal government, creating departments of war, foreign affairs, the Treasury Department. The story of Hamilton is fairly well known. A national currency, a tariff, a national judiciary, the Supreme Court, post offices, et cetera, et cetera. One simply cannot overemphasize, I think, the pivotal nationalizing role played by early American federal institutions scattered throughout this vast country: forts, arsenals, navy yards, custom houses, lighthouses, courts, post offices, right? And if you think about this as primarily a maritime economy, that's where the action is. You've already got the state and local governance. Of course, lighthouses are not insignificant. Ports are not insignificant. Customs houses are not insignificant. This is where the action is in early 19th century economic life. Okay? So it seems to me these are some of the constitutional foundations of the powerful nation state that would emerge in the early 19th century and continue its growth through the late 19th century and beyond. A second period of American history closely identified with the myth of the weak state is the late 19th century, a period frequently known for the existence of laissez-faire constitutionalism. So pervasive is this interpretation of the late 19th century and very early 20th century that I need barely mention it, laissez-faire constitutionalism, for most historians, constitutional lawyers, to be able to conjure up a favorite example, right, of a so-called conservative, pro-business, Lochner-era jurisprudence frustrating progressive social and economic regulation. In the History of American Law, which is the sort of main survey of American legal history written by Lawrence Friedman, Friedman summarizes the basic position of the laissez-faire constitutionalists by noting the 5 key cases that he says, and that also Edward Corwin says, annex the principles of laissez-faire capitalism to the Constitution and put them beyond the reach of state power. Okay, so these are the cases that basically take things away from state governments and keep them beyond the reach of regulatory power. The 5 cases are wholly familiar to students of constitutional history. Winnehamer v. New York, case in 1856, In re Jacobs, Godcharles v. Weigman, Ritchie v. People, and the granddaddy of them all, to which the era is usually named, Lochner v. New York, right? The U.S. Supreme Court, 1905. Could say more about that, but maybe we'll talk about it in questions afterwards. Now, 5 cases. In addition to questioning the number of cases on which to base such a sweeping generalization about the relationship of the Constitution and the economy in the late 19th century in this volatile period, and there are thousands of cases. There are thousands and thousands of cases to look at, but constitutional history keeps throwing up these 5 as the representative cases. Rather than look at those 5 cases, I think it's fair to ask about the economic representativeness of those cases. What are they about? The Winnehammer case, again, is about liquor prohibition, which a lot of people are concerned about in the 19th century. Cigar rolling is the issue in the case in Ray Jacobs. A nail mill in God Charles. Clothing manufacturers in Ritchie, and I'll give you that. I'll give you Ritchie. Clothing manufacturer is very important. And in Lochner, the hours of bakers, right? Again, largely in tenement houses. And in fact, if you look at what the court is preoccupied with in Lochner and a lot of the cases that it's citing to establish this principle, the cases are about horseshoeing, blacksmiths. You know, are these the 5 cases that we look to draw lessons about the relationship of the state and the economy in the late 19th and early 20th century? I would say no. Right? These are all about basically proprietorship enterprises. A court being worried, as we are today, right, about the fate of small businesses in this increasingly, in this period, national economy for ourselves, right, and increasing internet. That's what the court's worried about in those cases, but they're not the representative cases. What is not represented by those cases? Nothing less than the dominant sectors of late 19th century and early 20th century economic life. 1, transportation and shipping. Railroads, highways, grain elevators, ports, streetcars. 2, communication, telegraph and telephone. 3, energy, electricity, water, coal, and petroleum. And boy, do we need a historian, a good legal political historian of energy policy in this country. It's completely wide open for any of you that want to pursue that in the future. We just don't know enough about it. 4th, agriculture and horticulture. 5th, money and banking. Those cases don't represent the dominant sectors of American economic life. What do we know about those areas of economic activity? They were the preeminent areas of industrial and corporate consolidation and expansion in this period, and they were the areas that attracted the most intense governmental interest, intervention, and regulation. Indeed, these were precisely some of the major sectors of the economy that lawyers, economists, reformers, and legislators were busily trying to redefine as increasingly public in nature, right? And this is where the rhetoric, it's lost some of its force today. And it tells us about change over time. But this is where the law of public utilities really grows up, as people are trying to talk about these areas as distinctly public utilities and public services, subject to interventions ranging from increased state regulatory power, police power, to direct price fixing, rate regulation, to outright public ownership, which is what happens in, back to Newton Baker's Cleveland, right? The municipal ownership of gas, of light, in addition to water and the like. Indeed, in the economic basis of public interest, and again, this is a shorthand, not a definitive argument, I realize that, Rexford Tugwell provided a short list of the economic activities that he could envision as essentially public services by 1922. Bruce Wyman generated a far more extensive list in his earlier 2-volume, 1,500-page, 5,000-case treatise on public service corporations, right? Which is more representative of what's going on with corporations and regulation in this period than, I would argue, Lochner v. New York, right? These 5,000 cases is what we should be paying attention to. Tugwell listed 14 public classifications that covered a vast portion of American economic life, from railways and a whole variety of other common carriers to municipal utilities, so-called water, gas, electric light, turnpikes, hotels, telephone, telegraph, bridges, wharves, docks, ferries, stockyards, abattoirs, grain elevators, creameries, services for the distribution of the news, that's kind of an interesting one, the business of renting houses, fire insurance, banking, and my favorite, number 14, businesses for preparing for market and dealing in food, clothing, and fuel. Going back to Shaw, right? Are they leaving anything for other legislators to regulate, right, after you get done with this list? Tugwell's list is reflective of the extraordinary ambition and scale of the revolution in legislative, regulatory, and administrative law in this period of so-called laissez-faire constitutionalism. And again, I could add more to those lists, but I won't go over time. Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of these new state and federal regulations was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court as distinctly constitutional. Anti-lottery laws, antitrust, bold new policies in kind of federal antitrust, corporate monopoly laws, liquor laws, food, game, oleomargarine legislation. You didn't know it was such a fiercely contested, milk is the fighting ground of American constitutional law, milk products. Insurance companies, the regulation of businesses for water, gas, et cetera, et cetera. New York alone passed 1,595 statutes in 1929. This is before the onset of the Great Depression, before Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, and well before Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society, right? 1929, before we sometimes start to talk about the rise of a stronger state with FDR and the New Deal, which people will debate about, well before that, right? You have a kind of vast regulatory apparatus. These constitutional regulations in the supposed era of laissez-faire constitutionalism again raise the disturbing possibility that we've gotten the main story of the interrelationship of constitution, state, and modern economic development wrong, right? Missing this burgeoning law of public utilities and regulation, we've turned a handful of historically unrepresentative and frequently inconsequential cases about bakers and horseshoes and such things like that into a full-fledged theory of laissez-faire precisely because it fits the mythology, right? It gets repeated in classrooms, in courtrooms, and I think provides ample fodder for ideological warfare on both sides of the partisan political aisle. And the question is why, right? Why do these myths prove so salient and so resilient amidst extraordinary evidence accumulated for more than a century that they do not reflect any general, actual, historical reality? Before I attempt to answer that question in closing, however, I feel compelled to offer just a little evidence from our own period that suggests that the interpretive problem I have been discussing tonight is not dead and buried in the sands of the past. I do this with a bit of trepidation for historians, as distinct from the faux presidential historians you see on CNN and other kinds of news programs, right? Real historians typically shy away from what's known in the trade as these kind of current events, right? And we don't like to participate. There's no context, there's no distance to get any kind of balanced perspective, it seems. But I'm sure it's clear to everyone in this room that the evidence of the strong state tradition that I've suggested is there in the early 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, in the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States only continues to this very day, right? There's no sense, I'm sure none of you think that the American state has actually been taking steps backwards in terms of its size, strength, budget, resources, etc. in recent times. And as Mark Twain once wisely and wryly noted, history may not repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. At least since 1980, when Ronald Reagan famously delivered his first inaugural address and stated that government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem, we have lived through a time dominated by rhetoric of privatization, deregulation, anti-statism, neoliberalism. This is the dominant discourse, I think we could all agree. But underneath the rhetoric, the growth of the power of the American state seems only to continually reach new and unprecedented levels. In 8 years, Ronald Reagan famously failed to shut down an agency of the federal government. Reagan's forerunner, Richard Nixon, actually oversaw the most radical expansion in the American regulatory state since the New Deal. Under Nixon's watch, expenditures for major regulatory agencies rose from $866 million in 1970 to almost $5 billion. The Federal Register, the national listing of administrative regulations in the U.S., grew from 9,500 pages or so in 1960 to 75,000 pages around 1980, which is pretty much kind of where it hovers today. More recently, in response to the current economic crisis, we have collectively together watched unfold an unprecedented nationalization and redistribution of wealth in the United States of America. 400 to an estimated possibly $800 billion to bail out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, $180 billion to AIG, $45 billion to Bank of America, $35 billion to Citigroup, $25 billion to the American auto industry, $700 plus billion in stimulus, another $700 plus billion to the military, as Obama basically submitted to Congress, the largest military budget in American history to that time. Now, I'm a historian of American big government, right? If anyone's going to make an argument for the American government being bigger than we thought, I'm sort of your person. I didn't know this kind of money was available. I had no clue this could be done, and I don't think many people in the room had a clue that this could be done. Although the fact that it was done fairly easily is interesting. Someone knew that this could be done. That these resources are certainly there, right? The scale of these dollars dwarfs anything else in American history. As a fact in that direction, in 1993, before Bill Clinton ended welfare as we know it, right, in a very sort of public act, Do you know what the entire budget, annual budget of AFDC welfare was in around 1993, right? Which was seen by many as a cause of runaway federal spending and a big government out of control. The entire budget for AFDC was $12 billion a year. Those were the days. 12 billion. Now I can get my head around 12 billion. It's the 800, 700 billion I can't get my head around. So these are some serious examples, I think, of the continued growth of the American state. And if we add the expansion in homeland security, war, police, executive power after 9/11, the story only gets more serious, it seems to me. Just one illustration of a kind of the rapid changes that occurred in this era. You can glean it from the simple budget of the executive office of the president. The budget of the executive office of the president had hovered steadily around $200 million or so through the modern presidencies up to Bill Clinton. It'd be pretty much around $200 million or so each and every year. During the presidency of George W. Bush, the budget of the executive office of the president skyrocketed to over $7 billion. That's a 3,400% increase in the budget of the executive office of the president at the very top level of the American national government. No surprise, right? Most of those expenditures are entirely related to the reconstruction of Iraq, which was run out of the executive office of the president as opposed to setting up a kind of independent agency to oversee that process, okay? So these are important issues. And despite the importance of issues like this, I can't help but close with a much less serious contemporary example of the paradox I've been exploring in this talk. An example, I think, that harkens back to the wonderful ironies of those quotes from Shaw, Webb, and Hollings at the beginning of my remarks. Another newspaper story that I sometimes carry around, I like these sorts of things, comes from Chicago, where, as Kyle said, I spent 18 years. The story is entitled simply Cow. It's from the Chicago Tribune, 1996. It tells the tale of two recent immigrants who escaped life in the statist regimes of Eastern Europe in order to live a life of freedom, of liberty, of opportunity, of entrepreneurship in the United States of America. And though, as everyone here knows, Chicago is not really very far west, for most Europeans, right, Chicago still conjures up, right, an image of a kind of Wild West town of opportunity, freedom, liberty, sometimes even Al Capone-like style licentiousness and lawlessness. Well, the story goes, these two brothers from behind the Iron Curtain, they come to Chicago, they settle on the northwest side of Chicago. They immediately begin doing something that people have been doing, since time immemorial, that they'd been doing without government interference in the strong states of Eastern Europe from time immemorial, generation after generation, with no interference from government whatsoever. What they start to do is they drive into the Illinois countryside to buy, you guessed it, cows from a local farmer, thus exercising their natural right to contract and their natural proclivity to truck and barter. They then transport the cows back to their own private property, right, a garage in northwestern Chicago. And what they do, of course, is they shoot them, they butcher them, and they then provide, it's been done for years, right? You provide food for an extended family of neighbors and friends. Again, a basic activity, a basic human activity, one that they practiced and thought, certainly if you can do it in Eastern Europe, in the land of Chicago and liberty and laissez-faire, we should be able to do. What do you think happens in the United States in 1996 here in Chicago, in this land of laissez-faire, free contract, private property, entrepreneurship, and initiative, rugged individual rights? You guessed it, right? The authorities swarm in from the state level, from the federal level. Illinois firearm regulators cited the brothers. They used a .22 caliber rifle to kill the steers. It was not registered, right? So they get cited for that. The city's animal care and control department cites them for keeping an animal for slaughter within the city limits. Although Chicago grew up on this business, you can't do it in 1996 in the city limits. The city health department cited the brothers for unsanitary methods in preparing food for human consumption. The Park District got involved. The Hooved Animal Society got this proliferation of local officials who are regulating almost every aspect of American life. Pages of regulations, countless rules, a classic example of the different powers of the American regulatory state, right? It's happening at a local level. It's more dispersed. This isn't, right, the national minister of slaughtering that comes to, right? It's this whole array of sometimes public, sometimes quasi-public, local and state entities, but powers that frequently dwarf those of the most powerful Eastern European states. So to conclude, back to the question, why do we Americans so frequently miss this complicated history of regulation and state power? I'll cop out a little bit, but I'll retreat to David Hume, who I think in his essay of the First Principles of Government kind of put his finger on something, right? Where he reflected on the ever-present role of fictions and opinions in the support of governmental power, whether despotic or democratic. Hume said, quote, "Nothing appears more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophical eye than the easiness, the sheer easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. And when we inquire by what means this wonder is effected, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion, but ideas, but mythologies. From the divine right of kings to popular sovereignty to the idea of a government of laws, not of men, opiate fictions, national mythologies, and historical fables about origins, promise, and destiny have continually kept the great mass of subjects and citizens, I think in the United States as well as other places, from inquiring too closely into the changing nature and extent of modern governing power. The myth of the weak state, laissez-faire constitutionalism, I think are classic examples of just such fictions, right, to keep us from digging closer. We should no longer believe them. The extraordinary growth of power within the American state demands critical attention and historical explanation. In place of myths of American state weakness or original fantasies about natural man or laissez-faire, or even more common assumptions of simply the beneficence of American liberty and free enterprise, I think scholars and citizens should work together to find new ways to examine, to look at the force of law, to look at sovereignty and its constructions today, and the political and public consequences of the new distributions of power, as well as of wealth, that are rapidly unfolding under the Constitution of the United States of America. Thank you.
Graciously agreed to take some questions.
So just for fun, I'm going to throw out that maybe that the weak American state is a current contemporary reality. Just to give a couple examples, the majority of Americans don't want a national health insurance program that's not mandated by insurance companies. With the polls, they don't want that. Single payer wasn't even discussed in the current health care debate that we had in the past couple of years. Overwhelming majority of Americans, if you look at the polls, want a rapid move to renewable energy. Can't have that. Fossil fuel industry doesn't like it. I mean, this looks like if we want to get these things through the aid of the government, it looks like we have a pretty weak government, a weak American state.
Because there's opposition. Because there's public opposition?
I think that on issues that are really critical to American people, a lot of people are really concerned about, they look to their government to provide solutions that they like, and they don't see the government having the power to execute those against corporate power. Oh, it's just I'm kind of throwing it out as kind of a conceptual.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting idea, and I, you know, if in terms of actually explaining why the myth persists, I do think a lot of times the idea of the weak state is an oppositional discourse, right? And in fact, I would argue, in the eras in which you see the most extensive rhetoric of laissez-faire, of individualism, of pushback, you're probably simultaneously seeing institutionally, structurally, organizationally, the growth of the American state. And then we could debate what, you know, which continues to persist through the oppositional, which wins. Does the oppositional rhetoric win? Is the American state declining? Is it receding in its power? I still see a kind of fairly consistent national narrative of governmental growth, you know, with some limitations, right? Not unlimited by any means. But despite these moments of rhetorical opposition, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire. And, you know, when you start seeing that kind of rhetoric, rather than suggest that the rhetoric is reality, right, see what's going on the ground. And I think you'll find another era in the expansion of American governance. So this is I think it's no surprise, right, that in this particular era, after these particular policies, which are unprecedented, and they have precedence in substance, but not in scale, it's not an accident that we find, I think, more vocal opposition to them.
Would you, I'm wondering whether you think, is there a question of evenness in the country when we think about the weakness? What I have in mind are maybe two concepts. One would be the rural versus the urban. The second, kind of paired with it, would be the relatively new state versus the old. That might even be a east versus west. Sort of simply thinking about it, it would seem that there would be significant differences between what Montana is doing in the 1880s versus the state of New York and kind of the American mind there. And maybe I'm rambling, but isn't that in fact part of the root of the myth?
I think no question, right, the differences between opposition to certain kinds of policies, obviously the Civil Wars being the greatest example of very distinct regional differences over particularly the power of the federal government and its ability to intervene on certain kinds of property rights and commercial regulations, particularly involving slavery. No question. It's an empirical question, I think. It sometimes breaks down in odd ways, particularly along the new state, old state dynamics. Sometimes frequently, the early states, as you well know, right, in the Union had sort of a common law tradition that frequently gave them more ready pause to certain kinds of legislation than newer states in the Union, particularly states carved out of the Northwest Territory, right, that were more used to kind of federal intervention and not quite as jealous. So it can break down in interesting ways, but I think that's an important point, right, that there are these kind of differences. The rural-urban is always one that has intrigued me since my dissertation days. I just don't know enough about the degree to which American rural life, right, from the 19th into the early 20th century, which is the period I concentrate on, might be more immune, right? I mean, obviously, there's going to be sort of some lesser interventions into regular life there, but the degree to which kind of agriculture is also affected by, and horticulture is affected by a similar kind of regulatory impulse, I think that's still a kind of open question. And certainly West and East, I mean, as Richard White and others have kind of made perfectly clear, the mythology might be great. I once gave a talk about some of these themes in Las Vegas, where there's a very sort of prominent cultural mythology about Las Vegas basically being built on anti-regulatory impulses, right? Allowing things to go on there, prostitution, divorce, gambling, right, that can't go on anywhere else. But of course, as again, most of you know, right, the power of the Gaming Commission in Las Vegas, the power of water regulation in, the role of governmental defense contracting is just overwhelming, perhaps more so, dwarfing some of the kinds of regulations you'd even see in the East. But that goes also to this point about what breeds the rhetoric and the culture, even in the existence of regulation.
Yes, considering that our national debt is currently $14 trillion and soon to be $17 trillion, just how much more government regulation and government control do you think we can really afford?
It seems to be an open question from the historical perspective. This critique of government, of government indebtedness and government spending has been there from the first days of the Republic. I'm always amazed at the new sums that come across. I don't think there's any magic in the numbers. I think, again, when you're one of the richest nations that has ever existed on the face of the earth, and you're looking to the future as opposed to the past, I think the horizon, I can't see a kind of numerical limitation that in the past has stopped the growth of American government from achieving some of its goals, right? And some of its goals are creating, right? One of the things that's changing here is the scale of economic and social organization, right? So the big transformation from the early 19th century to the period of the late 19th and early 20th century, it's a period of crisis because we're moving from a local and regional economy to an increasingly national one, right? I think now the challenge is going to be moving from a national to an increasingly global and international one. And if the United States is going to continue to play a role on that scale, the numbers are going to grow. I don't see them as quite the same kind of impediment that perhaps a contemporary economist at this moment in time, just from the historical perspective. Because again, the issues are raised over and over and over. I can bring you texts from the 1920s, from the 1870s about government spending run amok. Again, the $12 billion for AFDC. How could we possibly be spending $12 billion on welfare provision, right, for poor families? And those numbers, which scared people at that time, don't quite have the salience, that they used to have.
I can see an argument made from, say, like a Rawlsian perspective that with the difference in income from poor to wealthy in the United States, that we actually see an example of a weak state and that there is merit to an argument like that. So I'm just wondering how you might respond to it.
So this is an argument that's frequently made, right, that some of the sort of weak state rhetoric comes from social scientists and analysts who say, well, yes, right, we're not going to argue that the American penitentiary system is weak compared, right, or the tendency to use the death penalty as compared to other, right? We get, they say, what we're really talking about is social provision. So the U.S. state looks weak because it tends to redistribute less of its money from A and to give it to B, particularly the poor. I think, again, that's an empirical question that there's some really nice new research on. A lot of political scientists Chris Howard is one of the more influential, who has a book called The Hidden Welfare State in the U.S., right? The U.S. redistributes an exorbitant amount of money, right? And money changes hands in interesting ways through the intricacies of the tax code, particularly through tax credits. There's a lot of redistribution going on that's not in the form of the direct kind of transfer payments of Western European states, but the home mortgage interest deduction, which I benefit from, that is an extraordinary redistribution of wealth, right? A tax break given to homeowners, right? That is not given to renters. So I think it's not a question of quantity about the amount of money or the proportion of money that the U.S. redistributes. I think that is quite. Howard makes a compelling argument that the scale is equal, if not more than, right, the scale of Western European governments. I do think, right, the key question is where's the money going, right? Who gets it? Who doesn't get it?
And just one follow-up.
Sure.
How do you respond to, say, Warren Buffett's article within the Times recently?
Yeah.
So how do you respond to, and I don't know if folks read that, just saying that as Warren Buffett, he has a lower tax rate than, say, his secretary. So I'm just wondering how do you factor in that article?
I think that goes to the question of, right, who gets who gets benefits and who doesn't, right? Who has influence, who does not? But I think I don't want to sort of pretend to be an economist. I think an economist is in particularly better position, I think, to answer that particular question. Again, when some of these kind of tax rates also have implications internationally, right? That the U.S. corporate tax rate has to be compared as well with what the rates of other nations are. So I don't want to pretend to weigh in on that particular question with any kind of authority from the historical perspective.
Go ahead.
How does the Tea Party factor into this rhetoric of objection to big government, especially with their, they keep wanting to get back to the Constitution? That's sort of what you keep hearing with respect to the Tea Party.
I think I'd answer that in kind of two parts, right? That these voices aren't unique, right? These kind of oppositional voices to particular kinds of regulatory policies are to be expected, right? That any kind of radical innovation in federal policymaking, state policymaking is usually going in a country as big, as diverse as this one is going to create, especially in a democratic one, could and should generate sort of opposition and critique. I would say, from my perspective, the attempt to look backward, right, I see as the more distinct. It's also been around for a very long time. I think it's the more problematic tendency, right, to think that we can sort of that what the United States needs to do is return to some kind of earlier era that, if I was convincing it all, I try to suggest doesn't exist, right? That it's a kind of mythic sense of some earlier America and it really shouldn't be in the early republic when slavery was so increasingly tolerated and dealt with and in so many different ways. Historians have a hard time with that kind of sense that there's an answer, a silver bullet in the past, or that we can return to this point of pure origin and our problems will be solved. I mean, if there's one thing I think history teaches us, right, is that we go forward into an uncertain future, and we're going to need new answers, right? We're going to need new future solutions. We're going to need to, we are obviously in the middle, right, of a big contest over, the size I think is not the issue, but the configuration of governmental policies, right? And we're having a quite open debate in this country about that. I think that's a healthy thing, but I think the answers are going to lay in the future with new configurations, reconfigurations, reforms, new ideas, right, that look to the past for certain kinds of examples, but certainly don't try to return to a past that, as most historians will tell you, is not so pleasant. Can I just add one more point on that? Just to give you some, historians know this, but, the past is it's not a great place. You wouldn't want to be around in the past, right? I mean, for instance, right, average life expectancy in 1900, right, the golden age of laissez-faire constitutionalism, is around 51 years of age. In 1900, only half of a birth cohort is alive at age 40. Life is short, it's brutal, even in 1900, in the first years of the 20th century, it's bleak, people are working too long. We now have historical evidence, Robert Fogel, a great kind of economic historian, people are not getting enough calories. That's why they're dying so young. That's why they're sick. That's why they're always, it's not a good place. And then if you look at it, what we've gone through from 1900, life expectancy moves to 63 in 1940, goes to 70 in 1965, today over 80. Today, 95% of a birth cohort is alive at age 40. And it's not until age 79, right, that only half of that birth cohort are alive. The answers aren't in the past. Life was short, it was nasty, it was brutish, they had a lot of their problems. They had a lot of overweening state regulation. I mean, the experiments with eugenical sterilization of moral and mental defectives, and we don't want to go back. Trust me, we don't want to go back. A lot of bad stuff is happening there. We've got to get to the future. And the past can be a schoolhouse, but we shouldn't be putting the brakes on a history that I think has its brighter days still ahead. At least if the demographics give us any trajectory to look forward to. Robert Fogel says, by the way, that's going to get to 100 very quickly. Life expectancy is going to 100 in a kind of remarkably short time. That's something to look forward to, it seems to me.
I'm glad that you mentioned Richard White and the New Western History several times in your talk, because it seems that the arguments they've made about the power of the federal government increasing with the expansion of the West fits in perfectly with your larger arguments and fills in a lot of pieces. More recently, Richard White has turned his attention from the power of the state to a new book on transcontinental railroads. And one of his arguments is initially counterfactual. He says that Samuel Huntington, Leland Stanford, and Jay Cook, these other people, they weren't railroad barons at all. They weren't powerful, ruthless, efficient managers. They were awful businessmen. Their corporations uniformly failed. They caused countries to go into depression. But where their strength was in tapping into federal money and regulations, and that their success as businesses is actually in getting some of that strong state to them. So perhaps there's kind of like two myths that coexist. The myth of the weak state, but also the myth of the strong corporation.
And not necessarily strong corporation, but certain groups that understand the power of the American state. They understand its budget. They understand that it is the only entity that can have 700 billion and 24 billion, that the resources are in fact there for the taking, ripe for if you know how to get, and I think that goes also to the kind of inequality question, right, of who has those kinds of influence.
There was a recent article from Silicon Valley that made a lot of the point that Steve Jobs and Apple had more cash on hand than the federal government. And it's a perfect case where a myth of one, the powerful independent business, is juxtaposed to the weak
The
state.
weak state, right, which might not be a reality at all because precisely those businesses flock to that state, right, for many of these exact kind of resources. I think it's an important story. I think the story, the history of the corporate form is something, there was a lot of work done on the kind of middle of the 20th century. There's still quite a bit of good work done, particularly in law schools on this, but the history of corporations. The corporation is a creature of the state. I mean, in the early 19th century, this is one of the acts of state building, right, of states to give charters to corporations as kind of special privileges for doing things that the state doesn't want to have to pay for, building bridges, building railroads, right? But they can give it to a kind of new entity, a new state creature that will get these privileges in return for higher expectations that they will be regulated. So I think there's a, but today we're kind of in an era where, again, we're reevaluating that, and there's a kind of move to thinking about the corporations as distinctly more private entities, indeed as persons entitled to rights, and that has a long history to it. But that's another history that I think could use kind of better telling and more sustained telling. And White's book, I think, does a bit of that.
This thing with corporations, I mean, they've been around for a long time, but I can't remember when it was that it changed. That originally corporations had only a certain a life length. Isn't that true? And then they had to be reorganized and sort of broken up and then start themselves over again. And that ended. I don't remember when did that happen. But
I don't believe, from my reading, I don't believe that was ever a kind of major position. So that very early on, one of the advantages of the corporate form, in the 19th century is going to bring a lot of extra regulatory attention. And in fact, that's why a lot of American businesses in the period actually moved to the partnership form, because they don't want that kind of state intervention. But one of the benefits of the corporate form in the 19th century was immortality. As early as the early 19th century. But there could be legislative limitations placed on certain kinds of corporations, but it's a complicated question because in the early 19th century, before general incorporation, right, how do you become a corporation? You've got to go, this goes to the access question, right? You have to go to the state legislature individually and convince them to give you a special charter, right, which requires the legislature to sit down and dictate the terms of that charter. But it makes very clear, right, that at least originally, and there's a very complicated history then, to trying to democratize that form that leads to general incorporation. But they're very much seen as kind of one historian calls them public service corporations.
so where do we go in current time with corporations certain corporations so powerful and such a concentration of wealth that the average American, I mean, we don't really have a voice. I don't feel that we make much difference. Even when we step forward and shout in large numbers, they seem to go like, big deal.
I don't have an easy answer to that dilemma, I assure you, but it's an important, I agree with you that it's an increasing issue. Yeah. But that was the critique of late 19th century robber barons. And, there was this, what's interesting, right, is in the late 19th century, right, the concern was that corporations were corrupting democracy because of the way they were changing the democratic process, before the way they were influencing the legislative process. I think we actually could use a little bit more redevelopment of that particular, it's not just an economic problem. Right? The corporation is not just an economic problem that can be dealt with in economic analysis. I think the progressives and some of the best social scientists in the United States in the early 20th century were right to say this is a question about democracy, right? That it's a question about power in a society that is supposedly democratic and where that power comes from. So I think that discourse could use some tweaking.
Time for one more question.
To what extent do you see governments actually colluding in the spinning of this myth of a weak American state? I'm thinking of, the debt ceiling, okay, which comes in, interestingly, as I understand it, right after the First World War, when there's this real phobia about, oh God, now we have a foreign policy and we're going to be a big military power, and that it's sort of linked to this old sort of Anglo-American phobia of standing armies and this expanding defense establishment, and oh no, we can't have this, this is going to involve us in debt, and so we have to put the brakes on it. Are there other examples of this? Is it something that, you know?
Absolutely. It's a constant force. I mean, I think that is one of the sources of the mythology, right? And that even in selling a more aggressive public policy, it needs to be couched in the bow must be taken to the mythology. So those of you who heard the president's address on the jobs bill, right, said, there's almost a direct quote, right? We are a rugged individualist. We are a land of rugged individuals. He has to gesture. He has to bow to the mythology when it's business as usual, right? This is a modern political institution, right? And these are modern political legislators, savvy, but the degree to which the rhetoric gets perpetuated by the state builders themselves is a really interesting one. But it has consequences. I mean, in the primary campaign between Obama and Hillary Clinton, when Hillary Clinton first floated her alternative, her health care plan, she completely couched it in the language of this will create no new bureaucracy, this will create no new governmental expenditures. Of course it's going to create new bureaucracy. Of course it's, we need, I think the mythology, has a kind of childlike quality to it, and that we should just be realistic and talk about what we want and what we don't want without these kind of gestures. Of course, this is a modern state. These are modern policies. This is a large country with increasing population in an increasingly global competitive environment. Things are, yes, we're going to have more bureaucracy and things are going to cost more, and we have to think about tough choices that we have to make there. But the idea that it's not going to cost more, that the size of the national state is going to shrink going into the 21st century, it hasn't happened yet. I mean, there might be these blips, right? These kind of returns to normalcy, particularly after wars. But there's a ratchet effect, right? There's the effect of the Civil War, World War I, and World War II on the powers of the federal government. Despite the rhetoric afterwards that we're turning to, it never goes back, right, to a kind of pre-war level. But I think that's a really important observation, right? The degree to which, even in building the American state, the rhetoric continues to perpetuate itself as part of an Anglo-American weak state tradition that's fundamentally about individual rights.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for the question.